Fire beats wood.
But water beats fire.
Pokémon types. There sure are a lot of them. Oh boy, what have I gotten myself into now? Elemental weakness systems are a common sight in many video games, and they are used to establish and structure a game's combat system, creating various niches and roles for the various spells, enemies, and abilities which a player encounters. Every game puts their own personal spin on the formula. In fact, this system mechanic is so omnipresent that there exist thousands of variants across thousands of games. There is no required number of elements needed to make such a system work. Even a few elements can do a lot to change the way a player navigates a game's combat system. You could have 3 or 5 or 6, so how about 19? Pokémon features 19 different elements or types, each with a different set of weaknesses, resistances, and immunities. Each Pokémon is allowed a maximum of 2 types, resulting in a staggering 171 different unique type combinations. Even after over nearly 30 years and 1,000 different Pokémon later, 9 combinations still remain unused. Now, Pokémon wasn't the first game to invent the element system. Elemental magic is a staple of fantasy fiction in general, and even within gaming, many games such as the Final Fantasy series predate Pokémon by several years. However, Pokémon has arguably the most famous, popular, and complex version of this system in all of gaming. And this is partly due to how it pervades every single aspect of Pokémon's whole gameplay. In many other games, elemental systems are typically a bonus, something nice to play into, but hardly essential. You'd be rewarded with some bonus damage like 10% or 20%, get some secondary perks like increased accuracy, or gain some other benefits. They serve as a mere cog in the machine, which is the game's overall battle system. But in Pokémon, elemental types aren't just a cog, they are the entire machine. Hitting weaknesses double your damage, adding on a whole 100% onto the damage calculation. And if the type combination allows for it, you can even quadruple your damage. And then there's the same type attack bonus, which adds on a 50% multiplier that stacks multiplicatively with the weaknesses. If you have your Pikachu zap a Mantine, you are dealing 600% damage to that poor Ray. The amount of damage gained from the elemental system is, put simply, absurdly huge. Too huge to ignore. Pokemon's elemental system forms the entirety of their battle system. You cannot do anything without paying consideration to type interactions. This is what makes their combat system so difficult for other games to properly replicate. You need to commit so hard to an element system that you'd go crazy trying to balance everything. So how did the game's original designers set up this mess of types? Someone had to be crazy to build and balance this. And indeed, someone crazy did. Remember, games are not created at random. Games are a human invention and therefore are built with direction, thought, and intent. Underneath this chaotic web of types, we need to remember that each type was created with certain goals and design objectives in mind. With some training and knowledge in game design, a designer can notice the results and evidence left behind from the original creators' attempts to achieve these goals and subsequently deduce their intentions. So let's do that. Let's go through every Pokémon type one by one and figure out exactly what was the intended game design for each of them. Starting with the first types a player will ever see in any Pokémon game: fire, water, and grass. These 3 are probably the first types ever designed, period. And if not, they were at least the ones which the game's creators paid the most attention to. Fire, water, and grass are the most important types in the entire Pokémon franchise because they are the first types which every player encounters and serves as their first introduction to the gigantic type mess that makes up the game's main combat system. As a result, they need to fulfill one major objective above all else. Be as easy to understand as possible. When it comes to traditional fantasy elemental magic, some of the most common stock standard elements include stuff like fire, water, lightning, wind, and earth. The fire and water types therefore make for perfectly natural fits for a fantasy game setting like Pokémon and are easily understood. But grass may raise a few eyebrows. Plant magic isn't rare per se, but it's certainly a B-lister among the magical elements. It's sorta like an elective or specialty degree you take at magic school rather than your foundational zappy magic curriculum. It isn't your Captain America or Spider-Man, but more of a Shang-Chi or Ant-Man. It's certainly cool and appreciated, but tends to be less exciting and commonly seen than shooting fire or ice. So from a fantasy perspective, it's certainly an odd choice over a more conventional magic type like wind. Why pick grass as one of your big three? To understand that, we need to delve into the key founding principle guiding the entirety of Pokemon's design: implicity or obviousness, capable of being understood even without explanation. 15 types and the relationships between them is a lot to expect a player to remember. So, to make this process as painless and intuitive as possible, many of the types have implicit or obvious interactions between them. Fire will melt ice. Flying means you are above the ground. Plants wither, wilt, and die during cold winters. You can't punch a bird, so on and so forth. This is intended as per the game's design. The implicit and obvious nature of many of these type interactions mean that a player is not required to actively put in effort to remember them, which helps to greatly reduce the difficulty involved in learning the type system. For example, the relationships between Dark and Psychic and Fairy and Dragon. The official developer stated reason behind why these specific interactions were created was purely for the sake of game design and balancing, as Psychic and Dragon proved to be too powerful. But that didn't stop players from trying to invent their own in-universe headcanons, like because humans fear the dark and because dragons die in fairy tales, to make logical sense of these interactions. Of course, the developers aren't going to discourage that. Why would they? If players are spending time thinking up justifications for type interactions, they are actively putting in effort to memorize the type system, rapidly accelerating the player's own learning process. If the player believes to themselves that there must be some sort of reasoning and actively searches for it, they will be all the more convinced when they actually do come up with one, and will remember their own personal trail of logic. This is why the huge majority of type rebalancing theorycraft is founded more on real-world logic than any actual game design reasoning. The key principle of implicit understanding is so integral to the type system that people legitimately forget that Pokémon is a game, and therefore builds up their world's game rules based on design and balance reasons. Type interactions are not solely dictated by what is logical, but also by does it make sense for the game's balance. Fire, water, and grass are chosen as the three starter types because they have what is possibly the most blindingly obvious triangle relationship in the entire franchise. Plants drink water, fire burns plants, water puts out fire. It is so intuitively obvious that even the youngest of school children can understand it with minimal difficulty, and the triangle relationship is absolutely essential. In Pokémon, many type interactions are one way, such as ice being offensively advantaged over grass but being defensively neutral, or rock resisting normal but being offensively neutral. That's a bit more complicated, whereas a two-way relationship is much easier to remember. Therefore, we get fire, water, and grass serving as the foundation of every new player's understanding of Pokemon's type system. And since these three are the foundation, their resultant type interactions all subsequently follow that same principle of being implicit and easily understood. Fire burns plants, melts ice, and kills bugs, but can't burn a rock. Water extinguishes fire, washes away dirt, and cuts through rocks. Plants require water and soil and can even grow on rocks, but get easily damaged by pests and pesticides. If Pokemon were to use something like wind or earth or lightning for their introductory elements, like what many games do, players would not cannot intuitively understand how these types interact. Water obviously beats fire, but how can a player rationalize how wind, earth, or lightning would beat water but lose to fire? There is no way to remember such a relationship without actively putting in effort to remember it. It isn't implicit and obvious. So to recap, the game's introductory types had two design goals: establish a triangle relationship and be as easy to understand as possible so as to serve as a smooth introduction to the game's core mechanics. To do so, they selected three elements with an incredibly obvious relationship and dictated many of these three types' interactions based around common sense logic. And the designers succeeded so hard at these goals that players began to apply that same common sense logic to all other types, simultaneously training themselves to better remember the type system while also concealing the actual game balance reasons behind why those interactions exist. It is also worth noting that these three types are also designed with specializations in offense, defense, and support in mind, something which is made obvious when you examine their interactions within the context of Generation 1. Fire was initially designed as an offensive special attacking type. The type focuses on dealing high amounts of special damage, but lacks much variety beyond that and is otherwise a one-trick pony. The type holds offensive advantages over bug and grass, and apart from itself and water, it is only resisted by rock and dragon. 3 advantages and resistances is typically the standard baseline metric for most of the types we will discuss later, so on paper this looks unremarkable. But one thing to keep in mind is the context of the overall game. Grass and bug are 2 of the most common types in the entire game, meaning that you'll deal super effective damage very often. And rock and dragon are the dedicated tank and ultimate types respectively, and are comparatively more rarely seen. But defensively, fire effectively resisted nothing. Resisting itself and grass is a given due to the requirements of the starter type triangle, but its third resistance of bug is functionally meaningless because bug moves didn't exist back in Generation 1. It didn't even gain its resistance to ice until Generation 2. In practice, you will rarely see your fire Pokemon resist anything. Fire's offense-heavy playstyle is supported by both Charmander and Charizard's stats, which boast higher offense and great speed but comparatively low defenses. In practice, Charmander users get to frequently move first and spam fire attacks for high damage for the entire game. But in return, Charizard is never resisting anything and is comparatively frail. The type's overall direction towards offense is also supported by the Generation 2's type rebalancing, which made fire fully advantage over steel, the new dedicated tank type. This offensive focus is also reinforced by the status condition associated with fire types: burn. All fire moves in Gen 1, from the Humble Ember to Mighty Fire Blast, have a slim 10% chance to inflict burn, adding on bonus chip damage to the target. Notably, outside of poison, this is the only other damage over time effect in the game. Even back in Gen 1, burn had the extremely potent effect of halving the target's attack, but this was never something to rely on because burn was designed as a bonus on top of fire's naturally high power. The low burn chance made this status too inconsistent for any defensive Pokemon to rely upon. Nowadays though, the philosophy regarding burn has shifted from an offensive to defensive application. Generation 3 flipped this dynamic with the move Will-O-Wisp, which dealt no damage but had a 75% chance to burn the target, and the Flame Body ability, which had a 30% chance to burn an opponent who made physical contact with the user, which allowed defensive Pokemon to reliably utilize burn's defensive properties. However, Will-O-Wisp is seemingly only categorized as a fire move by technicality and is more of a ghost move in practice, as during its debut generation, it was only learned naturally by Ghost Pokemon and Ninetales, until it became a TM in later generations. And even then, Burn does still indirectly reinforce Fire's offensive focus, as Fire is the only type in the game immune to it, ensuring their offensive stats cannot be reduced. Also, Sun was introduced.
power of the sun in the palm of my hand.
Which serves to supercharge fire damage to borderline nuclear levels. This is rather notable in that while Sun benefits both fire and grass types, fire types tend to focus on the primary offensive benefits of Sun, while grass focuses on the secondary benefits. Apart from the Paradox Pokemon, the majority of Sun-related abilities are possessed by grass types. The only fire types which get a Sun-related ability, excluding the part grass Scovillain, are Charizard and Mega Houndoom, who received solar power, and Torkoal and Ninetales, who were given the sun-enabling drought. This was likely done intentionally because fire types arguably didn't need any more benefit beyond Sun's huge offensive boost. 50% extra damage is understandably pretty huge on such an offensively powerful type. As time passed, the design of fire evolved greatly, in part due to its prominence as one of the big three types of the entire Pokemon franchise. The introduction of reliable burn in Will-O-Wisp provided fire with a meaningful way to take advantage of burn's defensive properties, and the type rebalances over the years doubled its number of resistances, from 3 to 6. These changes pushed fire into becoming a more well-rounded type overall, and the stats of fire Pokemon changed accordingly. Instead of many of them being focused on special offense, you can now see many fire types with a wide variety of stat spreads and roles. These days, it isn't uncommon to see fire-type Pokemon using both physical and special attacks, spanning a huge range of speed tiers and serving defensive or supportive roles such as the slow and bulky Torkoal, the speedy mixed attacking Infernape, and Incineroar, who can do whatever the hell you want and is basically the king of competitive Pokemon. The overall variety of fire Pokemon is quite remarkable. The fire type has really come a long way from the early days of Gen 1 and 2, when all it did was spam Fire Blast and Flamethrower and nothing else.
なら水でどうだ。
どうして火がつくんですかね。
可燃性なんだろ。
Water is the dedicated tank of the three starter types, and it is arguably the most successful of the three in terms of both in-game and competitive play as a result. The term bulky water has been around for a long time, and for good reason. Water is offensively advantaged against tree types and resisted by tree types. It seems straightforward until you remember this is Generation 1. The most common rock Pokemon enemies in this game are the Geodude, Onix, and Rhyhorn lines, all of whom are also part ground. Apart from Giovanni, the player will rarely ever come across an opponent which is exclusively either rock or ground, but not the other. In practice, this ends up being only one offensive advantage instead of two, and outside of one-shotting Geodudes, your Squirtle will rarely be seeing the super effective text. As for fire, it's a naturally rare type, with relatively few notable enemies having it, so you won't see as much mileage out of that compared to fire or grass for a standard playthrough. Defense is where water's strengths lie, as it only has 2 weaknesses, and as you know, 2 is a smaller number than 3. Notably, all of its defensive interactions involve the special types, with no physical types at all, implying that water's defensive properties were mainly focused on special defenses and not physical defenses. This certainly does imply it is intended to be less vulnerable than its 2 counterparts, but what gives the game away is the Gen 2 rebalance. Water gained a defensive resistance to steel, but no offensive advantage, adding even more onto the type's already great defensive profile. Water's defensive focus is showcased by Squirtle and Blastoise, who are turtles. You know, the animal whose entire evolutionary gimmick is being slow but having a sturdy defensive shell. Any player who looks at Squirtle and expects anything else has evidently been reading too much Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, because turtles are not fast ninja animals. I guess that's why they are considered mutants. Anyways, stat-wise, Blastoise supports the defensive nature of Water type, with defense being its most prominent trait. Apart from that, Water itself is remarkably straightforward. It has moves with great power, but lacks anything unique to really define its identity as a type. And the moves which are mechanically unique tend to support its defensive identity. Aqua Ring provides passive healing, Life Dew offers active healing, and infamously Scout applies Burn, which was so universally good because of Water's natural defenses that Scarlet and Violet forcibly nerfed the move's distribution by removing it from many Pokemon's move pools and provided Chilling Water as a much worse alternative. The actual big shift in game design for the Water type was the introduction of Rain, and that's because Rain is frankly overpowered. Sun's benefits are split between both Fire and Grass, with Fire getting the offense boost and Grass having all the utility perks. However, Water just gets both. Like Fire, Water gains a huge 50% boost to its moves from Rain, and like Grass, Water is also able to benefit from the utility offered by Rain as well, with many Rain-related abilities also being found on Water-type Pokemon. Rain is a huge part of what gives Water such a huge offensive presence, because Water types essentially get to double dip on everything Rain has to offer. With Sun active, a Grass type can boost its speed with Chlorophyll, and a Fire type gains a damage boost, but with Rain active, Water types gain both boosted speed and boosted damage simultaneously. Swift Swim offense aside, the majority of Rain-related abilities do tend to support Water's defensive nature, with the majority of them providing defensive benefits. Hydration grants status recovery, and Rain Dish and Dry Skin provide healing. Dry Skin also provides a free immunity to Water and a partial weakness to Fire. And, as I mentioned earlier, the huge majority of these Rain-related abilities tend to be found on Water-type Pokemon, letting them benefit from Rain in a huge number of ways. The exception to all of this is Dry Skin, which seems explicitly designed to be used by non-Water Pokemon. It is possible this was overcompensating the balance in comparison to Sun. Sun passively reduces Water damage, while Rain reduces Fire damage, but from a balance perspective, a Fire type removing a weakness might be perceived as being substantially more impactful than a Water type just strengthening an existing resistance. And Grass was dealing with extra risk by amplifying its own weaknesses anyway, so Water types were allowed to have both utility and power to compensate. Of course, that may have swung the balance pendulum a bit too far in the opposite direction, but that's a discussion for another day. I honestly do believe that if Rain never existed, Water would never have the offensive performance resume that it has today. Its actual defensive qualities would have taken the center stage. As is, Water is possibly the most boring but practical type, a reputation not helped by there being so many Water types in the Pokédex. It isn't as exciting as many other types, but being a Water type is rarely ever a bad thing, and it's practical in almost every situation.
Hello average Twitter users, hello average League of Legends players. Today we're going to be attempting something never done before. I know you guys might think this is crazy, but we are outside. This is where you go if you walk out your house, right? And today we're going to be doing something none of you have ever done before. So watch this and learn.
Grass is where things get complicated. You would think Grass, being one of the 3 introductory types, would mean it'd be designed with a straightforward series of interactions, but instead we get this mess. Offensively, it suffers from the same rock-ground limitations as Water, with the only benefit being that a Water advantage is more commonly useful than a Fire one. And the huge list of resistances tells us this isn't a type intended for offensive use, a fact which is supported by its lack of offensive moves. It lacks a 95 power counterpart to Flamethrower and Surf, and its 120 power counterpart is Solar Beam, which requires 2 turns to charge and activate, and thus has really poor overall damage. Likewise, defensively, that similarly long list of weaknesses tells us this isn't a reliable tank type. You'll take super effective damage far too often for that. It does, however, have notable resistances to electric and ground. Stat-wise, Grass Pokemon tell us nothing. Venusaur, Vileplume, Parasect, Victreebel, Executor, all of them have very different stat spreads with little in common. Venusaur, despite being the type's main representative, doesn't have anything unique about its stats either. So what is Grass supposed to be good for? The clue to the Grass type's design identity is actually found not in Venusaur, but Bulbasaur. When you level up Charmander and Squirtle, the first moves you get are Ember and Bubble, two offensive moves. But with Bulbasaur, your first move is Leech Seed, a utility move. With Vine Whip coming much later, the game designers prioritized giving Bulbasaur users a support move before an offensive one. Grass is the utility and support specialist of the three types, and are defined not by stats, but by move pool. Grass types have access to a variety of status moves such as Sleep Powder, Stun Spore, and Poison Powder, self-buffing in Growth, and even Drain-based recovery in Leech Seed and Mega Drain, letting them weaken opponents for your other party members to handle more easily and stick around for far longer than their stats would imply. And we see Generation 2 continue this train of logic, with the only grass moves being added being Synthesis, Cotton Spore, and Giga Drain, making for reliable recovery, stat debuffing, and an even more powerful drain move. This is particularly notable because move pools in Gen 1 tended to be very barren, and support moves in general were fairly rare, which made Grass's huge number of options stand out. This is best exemplified by Parasect of all Pokémon. Surprisingly, the single most powerful status move in Pokémon, the 100% accurate sleep-inducing Spore, actually existed all the way back in Generation 1. It was the exclusive move of Parasect, and this move was correctly identified to be such a powerful support tool that Parasect was effectively handicapped everywhere else to compensate. The Grass type's supportive focus is the reason for both their wacky type interactions and highly varied stat spreads. They are designed to be used in a variety of niche, specific situations, and not to serve as your primary attackers or defenders respectively. This is likely why it is given key resistances to electric and ground, while the dedicated tank types, water and rock, are weak to them. Grass is not meant to serve as general use tanks or attackers, but instead act as critical checks in situational circumstances. After all, you can't let your team's support also be the best at tanking or damage, or else something has gone wrong somewhere. The support's job is to make the work of offense and defense easier by providing important yet niche utilities which the others lack. Grass types change the game from being a numbers-based slugfest into something with a bit more strategic depth, and in the hands of a resourceful and clever player can prove more valuable than their more straightforward counterparts. This utility focus is also supported by the type's balanced interactions with Sun. Unlike the other types with their respective weather, Grass gains no benefit from Sun and is arguably made more vulnerable due to the increased fire damage, but it gains a variety of useful secondary benefits due to having the majority of sun-related abilities. Chlorophyll increases speed, Leaf Guard provides status protection, Harvest regenerates berries, and Flower Gift gives a stat buff to Cherim and its doubles partner. And of course, Solar Beam's charge up turn is removed. Unfortunately, as the years passed, this line of design aged the worst out of the tree. Move pool improvements gave the other types more utility options. We've come a long way from the days of Gen 1, when Grass practically held a monopoly on support types. Nowadays, it's kinda easy to forget that support used to be Grass's suite, and all we're left with is this oddly niche mix of weaknesses, resistances, and lackluster attacks. Unfortunate, but that's just a side effect of expanding move pools. Pokémon whose unique characteristics were having utility when no one else did just lost what made them so unique. Still, the Grass type's niche utilities keep it surprisingly relevant and allow it to seriously punch above its weight class. While the type might seem relatively unimpressive on paper in the modern day, you should never underestimate it, because you'll never know when the stars may align and a new Grass type Pokémon emerges with the very specific qualities needed to disrupt the entire metagame. Well, that's the first 3 types in what is surely going to be a fairly long series of videos moving forwards. I was initially planning to make this into a single video, but as I kept writing, I realized it would have taken forever and there'd be just too little time to explore the design of each individual type for longer than like 3 minutes each. Hopefully, this more individualistic format results in better videos. If you enjoyed the video, go ahead and leave it a like. If you didn't enjoy the video, then just leave a like anyway, because my monkey brain likes seeing big numbers go up. Also, let me know in the comments which type you'd like to see talked about next. I'm gonna do every type eventually, but I don't really have any sort of set priority list in mind at the moment. So let me know if you have any type you'd prefer to see sooner rather than later.